Welcome to this presentation on Demystifying Fuji Raw. Within this presentation, we are going to take a look at Fuji's X-Trans technology provided with the XT line of cameras. Raw data produced by this sensor requires some technical consideration and understanding to ensure you're able to produce the highest quality imagery. Not all software provides an equal experience and has led to a lot of online discussion about how we should be working with these files. With the right knowledge and some fundamentals that I intend to cover here today, we will be able to really establish best practice regardless of the choice of your software. Ultimately, you will be able to produce the highest quality images. Now, right off the mark, I want to start with a disclaimer and establish an objective. Ultimately, I think a powerful, well-executed image is really what matters the most. Now, as part of that, there are technical considerations. I feel like understanding these technical considerations and applying best practice allows us to then focus more on other and probably more important components of photography, such as composition, exposure, narrative, many others. The aim here with this presentation is to establish knowledge and what those best practices are when working with raw data to get a little closer to basically allowing you to stop thinking about that, trust in your workflow, and create just great images. I'm not going to tell you exactly which software to use for you. Which works better for you comes down to many other variables other than just raw processing. What I am going to do though, is we're going to unpack some of the issues that people have experienced, which is usually actually related to a process chosen by the software, the misconceptions around that, and we're going to talk through the solutions. So let's go ahead and explain what the problem seems to be. There is a lot of commentary or comparisons of Fuji film files being processed in Lightroom that don't have a satisfactory quality. And I've seen these myself. Often though, these comparisons are a bit misinformed or maybe even unfairly established to the solutions that actually Lightroom do provide. When we then look at those comparisons and we look at the commentary that we get, say, for example, within the community online, some of the feedback that we see or the responses or advice that people give can be anything from accurate to sometimes just plain wrong. So if we go and take a look at the general themes of the commentary that I have seen, it's the following four. Stop pixel peeping, you'll never notice it in the real world. Just use Capture One, it's better than Lightroom. You're sharpening incorrectly, turn the detail slider down to 0. Or you need to use enhanced details. Now, all of these are potentially accurate, but I feel like we could unpack these a little bit further to just take some components of those and identify where that advice stems from, and if it is actually accurate in this particular case. First up is pixel peeping. It is a valid point, but in the terms that where we're doing these evaluations of our images, I do fundamentally disagree. Sorry. We're at the beginning of an imaging pipeline. Best practice may extend beyond the perception of one-to-one. Where one-to-one review of an image comes into play is in the result. But when we're evaluating how we're generating that first stage, where we're taking raw sensor data and we're converting it to pixels, there is a whole bunch of processes that will come after that. And they can all enhance or exaggerate issues that we may not perceive otherwise. So pixel peeping is a valid comment or a valid point only if we're looking really at the final result. I actually work in a neighboring industry where pixel peeping is almost a known trope, and that is in visual effects. Within visual effects, we have to do huge amounts of image manipulation, often dealing with scenarios like actors running in front of green screens, and then replacing the whole world and integrating them into it to make it look like it was all shot in camera at that very point in time. The reality is, though, that in this process, through all this recreation and invention of a new world or reality, that ultimately there is a desire to go in and change little things, to have absolute control over every single element and judge it or make adjustments to it to a preference. It may be that, like we see the specular reflection on the leaf over here is a little too bright, or this warrior's hairline in the middle by the tree feels a little bit too lifted. But the reality is we're looking here primarily in the image. So, there is some validness that these things maybe don't matter so much. But there is a process within visual effects that we are basically taking hundreds of manipulation steps, and each one of those contributes ultimately to the final result or realism. Even just a breakdown in few of those steps can actually affect the end viewer. Differentiating from what matters and what doesn't gets a little hard to be objective, especially when we're seeing these images for months at a time, which is how long a shot like this can actually take to make. But the takeaway is, while there is a tendency to really scrutinize an image, the reality is the results are reviewed at 1-to-1. It's the processes or the steps to get to that result where we need to be more careful than just looking at that 1-to-1 result. In visual effects, to make the image you saw before, there are literally thousands of stages in that process where we're manipulating the pixels. And if any of those stages actually degrade the quality of the image, those will build up, and even though they're imperceptible as you do them, the final result will flag them, and then you have to go back and go, well, somewhere between the start of this image and the end of the image, we're losing a quality, and you're actually impacting on the result, and the client will decline that. Now, that is pretty extreme scrutiny, but the takeaway is that by understanding exactly how to evaluate those images, as you see me doing here with an image, I'm able to identify potentially those issues, okay, and make sure that then no matter what happens to the images, as it leaves me and my tasks, say maybe as converting the film camera image into a digital image, that there are going to be no further issues downstream. Now, there is an element that we have artists go in and fix these issues as part of the VFX task, but obviously we want to minimize that. And I'm going to use some of the techniques that we are seeing here, me demonstrating this image analysis, and using this exact tool, which is a compositor called Nuke, to look at the results of some various bits of software to really actually compare those together. So at the end of this presentation, we will do a comparison and we'll talk about it. Now, the other aspect of pixel peeping is, well, it really does depend on subject matter, how much post-processing you actually need to do, and the delivery medium that all depict the scrutiny that the image needs to go under. Somebody on the internet just saying, oh, you don't need to worry about it, nobody will see it anyway, well, they don't have the context to make that call. In the case of photography like this, it is very much black and white, high grain. I'm not too concerned with if my chain link fence is resolving with high detail. As long, what I'm leveraging here as far as drawing is the subject matter. It's the people lined up, not 100% obvious what they're actually doing. You explore the image a bit, you may get a read that there's some are holding fishing rods and they're actually fishing. But other than that, it's almost actually a detraction if we could clearly see all their little fine fishing rods. I'm almost trying to hide that fact a little bit within the photo, and that's what makes it interesting to me. It leaves some mystery in it. In the case where we have almost this vernacular style photography, which capture these daily moments of unassuming actions that inadvertently transition into an art of photography, it doesn't matter actually what the image quality is at all. Okay, and I assure you, like if I had shot this photograph on a Fuji X-Trans or a plastic toy camera from that I bought for $20, it wouldn't make probably an ounce of difference into actually the appeal of this photograph, which is the moment. We have these characters that are sort of jumping around on one leg. We get some sense of motion through a blurry arm, and then we see a figure that's being sliced in half and their foot not quite touching. At no time are you actually evaluating, like, is this a high quality capture of this scene? To flip that, we also have photography like landscape or urban, okay, where in this case, the image is more so a place where we stand and observe and find different reads. There may be a narrative attached to it, We're looking at the image for a primary read where we're seeing subject matter, and then there'll be secondary subject matter and tertiary subject matter. And you find yourself lost in exploring that image. In this case, we primarily have the streaking of the SkyTrain and the streaking of the traffic. It's where most of the visual weight comes in, and it's the most interesting area of the image. But as we're allowed to look at the image further, we start getting more subjects out. We start seeing the group of people at the intersection in the bottom right. You might find the figures in the top right, okay? And as we work our way our image, we can see the street sign. We get an inclination, where was this photograph taken? Is that of interest? We see a little stall where perhaps there is a sign that somebody might stop and read. And in the top of the picture, we also actually see that there is a body of water. And it's just through the delicate reflections of a street light off camera that we actually get a sense that that is water. It's those little details that can be very important and where image quality really comes into play. There are cases where we use our cameras to explore the world and present details beyond our perception. And it is very much a case that making sure that we're capturing the sharpest images possible really helps sell that. In the case of, for example, macro photography, as we have here. This image here, in particular, I shot at 16K. It was stitched together from multiple photographs for an object that was about a half centimeter in length. And it's taking us and bringing us into a detail in the world that, is part of that enjoyment. This is what the image is about. It's actually showcasing you something that we don't perceive. So in this case, I find that image quality is very important. There is also just generally a best practice that we generally follow when we're working with digital images, and that's to minimize any destructive process where possible. We see this in tools such as Affinity Photo, which is a competitor to Photoshop, where we see the layer-based system here providing every layer actually working very non-destructively. Every correction, every filter is able to be enabled and disabled. Now, they are inherently manipulating pixels, and they may introduce issues, but at no time are we actually fixing those values, and we can adjust them on the fly with none of the previous processes affecting them or causing order of operation issues to an extent. In visual effects, we use compositors, primarily node-based, which allows us to always draw potentially from a source or some bit of information from upstream to ensure the highest quality. In this case, I have a screenshot of it here. You'll see that we have an original image and it's going through post-processes. We have some glows, we have some color correction. If after all those processes are done and I want to use the original image to generate a mask, I can branch off and I can do that. I don't have to work with the manipulated pixels, basically whatever effect they have that might actually influence the quality of the mask that I want to generate. So non-destructive workflows, very important. Finally, future-proofing the application of your work. And this ties a little bit within the delivery medium statement I made a few points ago. Ultimately, if we look at the development of digital imagery in the last 10 years, it's improved significantly. When I bought my first SLR, I was obviously very happy with the result and dreamed of having an even better camera and looking at that. At the time, I believe it would have been the 5D camera. Something like that I would have dreamed of having. And now, cameras with smaller sensors, even probably some phone cameras using AI technology, outperform those marvels of, stellar image quality from even just 10 years ago. And we're now scrutinizing our images further and further. Our displays are getting higher resolution. Our acuteness to detail and expectations are forever on the rise. And as we go forth, who's to say that in 10 years from now, we aren't all going to be sitting behind 8K displays? Or that at that point, you're going to be presenting your work in a gallery where people will be standing a foot away from your prints, which may be large format at that point, and, judging your work on the actual image quality that you've captured. In the case of some of the photography styles that I mentioned before, they would be subjected to that. All right, so let's address the next statement that we see. Just use Capture One. Well, that really, for me, comes down to the individual. there's a whole lot more attached to choosing your piece of software than maybe just the quality of the image that you're getting out of it. There are many, many other considerations, right? So in terms of what those are, that will depend on the individual, their needs and the resources they have, financially, hardware, and their objectives within their photography. So as an example, I'm going to state that I'm currently a Lightroom user. And I'm going to give you my reasons why I choose Lightroom. For me, it's about the interaction with the software. Okay, there are some very basic elements that I've had problems with Lightroom in the past that caused me to use another application for processing my RAW files. Now those have been addressed, I find Lightroom to be a suitable option. There's my tacit knowledge, my ability of understanding that if I reach for a slider and move it around, I know how it's going to respond. And having spent some time with Capture One, I found that my processing and my instincts of how the application is actually working, or the way it manipulates the pixels, haven't really aligned with my expectations. And it's resulted in my images having a certain look that I didn't like the appeal of. Now with time, I may be able to address that. But there are other conditions that obviously play into this as well, not just that. Workflow. There is naturally a workflow as you take your digital images from your camera and get them out to wherever they need to go, be it online, into print, wherever. And for me, the Lightroom workflow works very well. I like the cataloging system, I like the management of my images, and I feel I have a lot of control, which I don't get that same experience with many of the other raw processing applications. Resources. So for me, it comes down to like, where am I working? What is the resources I have available to me to perform the task of processing my raw files into their final delivery. And for me, it's actually a desktop PC workstation with a high-powered graphics card and a 4K 30-inch display. Now, if you are working on a laptop with less RAM, maybe not a very powerful GPU, then maybe my workflow that I like using Lightroom for and the steps that I need to take to achieve quality may not be suitable for those resources. I know some people like to just use an iPad, sit on an iPad, process them up. And it's very much a case that what I've identified as a best practice is not actually able to be replicated well on those devices. But for me, Lightroom, for me, fits the bill as terms of based on the resources I have. Lastly, and I've put this last intentionally, image quality. I can achieve very high quality Fuji X-Trans images out of Lightroom, as I know I can in Capture One as well, and other applications too, like Raw Therapy, because all of those applications do offer a way to correctly process those files. Now, the workflow between those three applications is what varies, and there is an inherent expectation of what that workflow would be, which has some people jumping camp. They want to have one workflow expectation based on what they're used to, based on what's comfortable, that may make them make that choice, and that's totally valid. But for me, image quality is actually less of a factor, and we're going to talk more about that. To demonstrate my concepts around interaction and tacit knowledge, in Lightroom, I see a nice smooth slider response. When I grab for a highlight, I see the values affected that I expect highlights and the white slider to affect. I have a nice, cool, sort of interesting implementation of a curve system. It's simplified. It makes it easy to manage. I even have an on-screen interactivity with it. Meanwhile, in Capture One, I get much more sticky sliders. That may be down to my system. And the response of the sliders for things like highlight do not affect the areas where I expect. And in this case, there is a white pier where I'm pointing my mouse to, which I can't seem to get any of the sliders to respond to. The curve system is nice. It allows me to drop points and create a very custom control, but I don't have any interactive with my image interfacing with it. So it's something that I miss. Another aspect is based around how I do my photography. Very much being as much about the processing of images as the capturing of them. I value both aspects quite highly. In the case of producing really detailed, high-quality images often actually with gear that's not up to the task sometimes in difficult situations like low light, I will do things like set up long exposures. I may even actually, in the case here, stitch multiple photos together to increase my output resolution. In this case, this was a vertically shot 3 side-by-side images that I stitched together that produced me almost a medium format quality with gear less capable of achieving that just on its own. Where does my choice of Lightroom come into this? Well, I'm actually able to perform the stitching and processing directly as part of my editing workflow. And I would like to do that before I start working in with color and exposure correction. So I need to retain that latitude. It just keeps everything nice and packaged up for me, and I like it. That is certainly a benefit. In the case that I can use a camera, or I find that a single shot is enough, we still deal with issues around limitations of dynamic range. Even the best cameras only at best sort of hit around 15 stops. And in the case of landscape photography, it's not uncommon to find yourself in a dynamic range of a bright sky against a dark foreground where, we're dealing with more than 20 stops of latitude. Multiple exposures and being able to stack them and then bracket and blend those back together without using automated processes like auto HDR, which I personally despise, gives a crafted look that lets me emulate the workflow prior to actually having this latitude and this flexibility of using real-world filters, which I used to make a lot of use of. We've already touched them on computers, okay? And for me, again, it's that I'm working on a PC, desktop, with a very powerful GPU. All right, so let's move on to the next point. And this is a really interesting one now. You are sharpening incorrectly. Well, perhaps. And certainly if you're seeing artifacts from doing sharpening, you're probably doing it, you're probably not following, best practice. But ultimately, sharpening in itself is artifact inducing. And the issue that you're seeing may not actually be the sharpening itself. It may not be the root of the problem. All sharpening is a post-process filter that modifies the luminance within your image based on neighboring pixels values. So by that, it basically, if you have flaws in your image that pertain to a contrast, sharpening can enhance that. Just like it can enhance the perception of sharpness, it can also, enhance where pixel value has gone incorrect or highlight issues that we've heard come up in Fuji discussions on several occasions. So let's firstly take a look at what is sharpening, because there's no such thing as actually truly sharpening an image. We're just playing into our perceptions. True sharpness is actually defined by the actuance of like how quickly something can change from a value to another value in a very short, small area. And in the case of resolution, having lots of pixels can make that very small. The resolving of the image, the ability for one pixel value to be different from another, is then also feeding into that sharpness. As we see here, the lines in the high resolution side are able to transition between those two values very quickly. While if they're blurred or there's not enough resolution to make that transition, it perceives as lower resolution, where the accuracy is actually lower and we're not getting that tightness within that change. So how does a sharpening filter address this? Well, it accentuates the contrast between those 2 points. It can't make that actuate any tighter, but what it can do is it can further increase the value of brights, neighboring dark pixels, and lower darker values, even darker. So what happens, that transition, that gradient that we see actually has further to go, and it's changing the actuation of the change of value much, much quicker. And in this case, it's exaggerated like massively to try and showcase the logic of how sharpening works. But what we do perceive is, if you were to say step away from your screen a few feet, ultimately your brain tells you that, hey, this lower half feels sharper than the top half. When realistically, it's just actually pushing values around. If I was to come in here and have a look at a photograph that has been over sharpened, we'll see actually the issues that we can expect to arise. If we were to say, look at these 3 regions here, you'll see that a white edge against a dark background creates a black fringing effect. Meanwhile, the black beak against the lighter background relative to it creates a white fringing effect. These are all sharpening artifacts. And the other thing that we notice is that sharpening can increase the appearance of noise, which makes sense, right? Noise is these varying values, and it's pushing those values further. It doesn't create the strong effects we see with the whites and the darks, but it is enhancing or separating that contrast between those grains, that noise value. So let's address then Fuji specifically. We hear this all the time. Sharpening Fuji files gives me worms. These guys. Where what we see is this worm-like structure as we ultimately push our sharpening in our images too far. Now, this both plays into the idea that maybe you're sharpening incorrectly. That fundamentally, if we leave the statement there, I think is correct. You are over-sharpening at this point, and you're pushing the sharpening engine beyond what's capable. What you're trying to do is you're trying to actually recoup details that never existed. And you end up pushing it to a point where we get these worm artifacts. And the reality is, if you over-sharpen, well, all over-sharpening, as we see even in a good photo with the bird, will cause artifacts. There's just something about Fuji files, though, that make that worm-like structure appear a lot sooner. So let's actually dive a little deeper and look into the root of the cause. And it basically comes down to the art of demosaicing. We're going to talk about demosaicing in a lot more depth, but basically the translation from that raw digital file into your final picture is the art of demosaicing. And depending on the way you demosaic, this is something that is variable. It's something you can, there's different options that you have available to you that can depict what the grain structure of that digital photo appears like. Now, in the case of film, okay, that is the same process as processing your film. You're taking the film and basically converting the film and developing it and creating basically a print of that original capture of light, which was recorded basically on the film, and converting that into a print. It's the same thing, really. And what's interesting is that if we consider demosaicing as the digital equivalent to that darkroom process of processing film, then incorrect processing of a photo could give us a form of reticulation, which is an artifact known in film processing. To showcase what that looks like, here is a piece of film that has been incorrectly processed. And what do we see? We see worms. The mistake made here within the film processing, or actually, in fact, this example was almost an exploration. They intentionally, when you process film, you might break the rules a little bit to try and create an effect. And that was kind of what was explored here a little bit. And what happens is the emulsion can sort of separate and ultimately even form cracks. This hasn't gotten to the stage of being cracked yet. But basically, all the grains within the film, the grain structure has collapsed and created basically sort of a collection. And in the sort of randomized noise structure, we start getting lines where they all bunch into the largest areas, and it creates this wavy pattern. And what is actually being lost here within that detail is those smallest details that would normally fill in that structure, the high frequency noise details, is actually being destroyed. So let's look at a piece of film correctly developed and compare that to Lightroom to see if we can draw any similarities between demosaicing and the film and why we might be getting worms. So here I have a correctly exposed grain structure of film. So when developed properly, this is what you see. And if I do a comparison between our digital equivalent, both between a correctly demosaiced Lightroom file and a Capture One file, you'll see that there are more similarities between Lightroom and film than to Capture One. So I'm not saying one is better or worse, but what I am saying is that as far as a structure of the image, we are prone to potentially, if we have the same artifacts or we simulate the same effect that we saw for reticulation in film, we might actually also find ourselves heading towards worms because they have very similar structure. Ultimately, Capture One removes or tries and mitigates that larger, softer grain structure, and in turn demosaics in a way that creates a smoother gradient, but with smaller noise detail. Within that detail, and we'll see this in the comparison then as well, there is a little bit more contrast within that. And if you take away the appearance or work in a very, if you work in a way that doesn't induce a lot of grain structure, okay, there are potentially some benefits, to not having that fine grain structure detail that we see in Capture One. But again, we'll talk about that later. So we've identified that incorrect processing can have this effect. So ultimately, incorrectly demosaicing an image, or basically doing a poor form of demosaicing, will actually limit the amount of detail we can resolve out of the image. Your camera is already making an approximation of what the pixel is based on multiple samples of the neighboring pixels around it. And if we do that incorrectly, you're not going to get the right pixel value. This is going to strip the image of all that high frequency detail, and thus the grain structure will be affected. And it sounds kind of similar to what the incorrect film processing was doing. Now, unfortunately, users unaware of that degradation, they'll maybe just perceive it. You load it in, you can't see it directly at 1:1, or maybe you can feel it. It's like, oh, something doesn't feel quite right. Feels a little bit soft. I'm going to sharpen my image. That's where the problems begin. Now we're building processing on top to try and counteract, ultimately, a workflow that hasn't been executed very well. And then we realize that there is the worms. So we're sharpening our image, or we're more readily sharpening our image now, and then, how do we get rid of these worms? Then the next workaround comes along. The detail slider solution is born. But let's actually talk about why that works. It's going to actually point to an issue that we're sort of highlighting around demosaicing. Lightroom sharpening currently has 4 key parameters: amount and radius. Amount obviously being how much the contrast variance, how much contrast variance it's going to introduce. The radius is the fall off of that. And you'll remember in the spiral that it has a ringing, and then that has a size or a radius that affects. And then we have detail and masking. Actually, both of these are a form of a mask. What detail does is where basically the sharpening effect is applied will depict on the detail level. So when we say detail, you could say high frequency versus medium versus low frequency details. This is a useful thing to differentiate, because if you have a grainy photo, but you want to generally sharpen maybe, the edge of a wall or something, or, the silhouette of a character, what the detail slider lets you do is avoid those fine single pixel value adjustments and look for the larger forms that generally have that. So we're kind of able to see through that noise. The masking option is kind of a similar strategy, except it doesn't use the frequency of the detail. It uses the average of the surrounding values. So for example, if the noise levels or the contrast between the noise is relatively low, only the edges of the highest contrast, like black and white, or like almost black and almost white, are going to be pushed further, while leaving the lower values alone. So both are very powerful controls for controlling where your sharpening happens. It is a development or an improvement upon techniques such as high-pass filtering sharpening or unsharp masking, which if you're a Photoshop user and have been doing sharpening within that application, you may be familiar with those sharpening techniques. Today, I'm actually going to introduce you to another concept around sharpening as well, which you'll see in our comparison. But the issue really lies then is that the detail slider allows us to sharpen at a level where basically we can avoid sharpening at the detail level, which is the highest frequency detail where that grain structure exists. But the issue is still there. Okay, so, and the issue is that it's at that level where we're actually having issues with our pixel values. And we have already identified that that is where we're losing the resolving power of our image. So if you demosaic correctly, the takeaway is you won't need to sharpen as much. You're going to get a sharper image out of the box, which just equals better pixels. So let's rewind at this point and let's talk about demosaicing fundamentals. I probably hear a few sighs. Many of you probably know this well, but it's probably worth revisiting because ultimately the software choice and how we work in our software ties into these fundamentals. So when we talk about a raw file, okay, we're actually not talking about an image. Any format, .raf, basically any camera raw file is not actually an image format. What we're recording is we're recording using the sensor values coming off the sensor within the camera. We're recording an electronic level or signal that it captured based on its sensitivity to a light. And it is then the applications like Lightroom and Capture One that actually act as renderers. They convert those values into pixels. Now here's the thing. Every pixel does not capture exclusively what intensity and color of light that was. So while there are sensors out there that are able to achieve that, they're prohibitively expensive, and our perception of the results actually don't really benefit us in any other way other than if you're doing, say, for example, visual effects and you need, data that is far more defined or has a high fidelity than actually anything to do with our perception. I'm talking about things like if you need to pull a green screen, having definition and color is very important. You can't even see it, but when you start working with it, you will notice the difference. So in fact, the sensor is made up of many photosites, and on top of these photosites, we have a red, green, and blue filter system. Okay, and in this example, we have what we call a Bayer filter overlay. Pretty much each one of those little squares on the gray grid underneath represents a pixel, and each pixel then either captures the green light, the red light, or the blue light contribution of the scene. In fact, the reason why we've got these red, the green, and blue values is that they match up with our perception of how we see light. We see in red, green, and blue as well. And in fact, we don't see those colors evenly. So the Bayer system pattern that we see here is pretty cool because it actually has twice as many green as it does red and blue. If you look closely, you'll kind of see that. And when we actually go and have that incoming light capture, you'll see on the resulting pattern at the bottom, we're getting twice as much information for green. That's awesome, right? Why is that awesome? Well, because our eyes are most susceptible to changes in green information. We have the highest acuteness of perception within the colors of green. Less so in blue and less so in red. Now, that still leaves a problem. That means, well, wouldn't that mean every other pixel only captures one color? And that's correct. And that's where the art of demosaicing comes in, where you take neighboring pixel values and you find sort of a formula of how you can merge those results together and say, well, these 4 surrounding pixels have this much green in it. I'm going to assume there's this color within the blue pixel. And the blue pixel will then do the same for a neighboring green pixel. And then that pixel will do the same for a neighboring red pixel. And you can even see this happening as a multi-pass operation where you can go through multiple times and look at the results and then use the results to then recompute the results and so on and so on. And demosaicing science is born. This is something that is forever ongoing, and different algorithms produce different results. And it is the key point of difference between image quality of our raw processes. But there is a component to this that what you may have observed is that the sampling of luminance, okay, what is the luminance of a pixel, is ultimately a lot more defined in that every pixel is receiving a luminance value, but only every other pixel is getting color. So color definition, or the resolving of accuracy of color, is actually interpolated, while luminance is more accurate. And this plays into another thing related to our perception. Luminance is far more defining of detail than color. Here's an image where we only suggestively, using a grid, imply the color of something, and our brain just puts it all together. And we see this as a full color photograph. Yet if you think about it, only every other 10 pixels actually says what color it is. So our brain puts it all together. And if we were doing this at a much finer detail, like on a Bayer sensor, we wouldn't know the difference. And you don't perceive it. But the issue is, obviously, if you start processing or you want to, say, generate a mask based on the hue of a color, at that point, it becomes a bit more important. There's another issue though, even in regards to luminance and color values, is that ultimately taking an approximation or an interpolation of the scene in front of the camera, well, that can introduce biases. There is going to be some loss of information, and potentially, depending on this grid pattern, we might hit a scenario where it gets confused. It's not accurate. So in the case of a Bayer system, if I was to draw a diagonal or horizontal, you see that the horizontals, just where that line falls on that sensor grid, oh, we're getting no blue values. So we're getting a bias there. We're potentially getting some aspects like false color being introduced, where if that was a blue wire, we would not be correctly recording it, and it might actually introduce the incorrect color. The diagonal, you see the same thing with the green, okay? And the idea then comes into, well, what if we change the layout of this Bayer pattern to be a little bit more flexible in how it captures that? And that's ultimately where X-Trans was born. Now, some key differences. There is even more green. So we're trying to capture even more green perception. And the other issue is that if we apply those same lines to it, you'll see we're much more accurately able to capture the correct samples, or we're actually representing all three image channels equally. Now, that's not to say that there isn't issues with X-Trans. Every demosaicing process is prone to issues. For example, down here, I can still draw a 45 diagonal and only hit green. Green, though, being actually the most important one to sample, because we're most sensitive to it. And if you look through the image, it's not going to be every second pixel across. You have to walk a few pixels over before you hit the next area of issue. And where this ultimately becomes noticeable is when you're resolving very, very fine line work and detail. In the case where you have lots of fine detail, we can get a lot more false color appear, and you can have a breakdown of actually the luminance and what the separation of details are. So in the Bayer system, one way they mitigate this is they either work at a very high resolution, say something as like 30 megapixels and above to resolve, or you can put a filter across, which basically creates a little bit of a smear, and it creates that into the incoming light. So rather than having the issue appear as part of demosaicing, we're guaranteeing that no matter how it's demosaiced, we're actually making sure that some of those samples of color or value hit neighboring pixels to make it a little bit more accurate. And there's definitely advantage of treating the source, as the theme of this talk is, as far as treating the source than treating it after the fact using processing and algorithms. So the takeaway here is that ultimately X-Trans, because of this nature, can be sharper than sensors with the same pixel count and that optical filter, because it doesn't need that filter to address it. This creates less moire for comparable sensors that are under 30 megapixels, and you're going to get less false color, I believe, when you're getting into high ISO. Less color noise, yeah, maybe not exactly the correct term, but certainly at high ISO where we're dealing with lots of grain structure being processed that is behind the sensor. It's basically the separation of the noise floor to the input signal. We're going to get more accuracy into the separation of those two. The Bayer system does have advantages. Okay, it's a lot simpler to demosaic, so it's something that works well as a real-time process. The sensor is cheaper to produce, so you generally can afford maybe more megapixels or larger sensors for the same price. And generally, because it is the prevalent sensor pattern, you get better support in raw processing. So what I've gone ahead and done, just as an experiment, is I've taken the two sensor patterns and I've overlaid them. And the reason I've done this will be evident shortly, but if we take a look at what I receive, when I put these two over the top, we can actually see that if we were to assume that the incoming image is Bayer, and instead we actually give it an X-Trans file, you can see the regions that are actually correct and the remaining regions that are not computing the right values. You'll see here that it's literally every block of 3 apart that we only have what pretty much is halving the color resolution at this point. So the accuracy of color is halving out, and the values in between those points, with the exception of the green values, is actually producing false color or incorrect color. And what actually happens is that if you start mixing red, green, and blue values incorrectly, or you're sampling a blue and you're replacing it with a red, and then you're taking the red and you're replacing it with a blue, you actually lose chromaticity. You actually lose chromatic information. The luminance is retained, but the chromatic information can neutralize itself, and you get a loss of color definition. Okay, and it's something that I haven't seen anybody really talk about, but ultimately, X-Trans incorrectly demosaicked can really affect color reproduction. And it is a case that it's not so much, bad data as far as our cameras are concerned, but as far as the software, if its expectation or its requirements for what's coming in is Bayer, and we feed it X-Trans, we're giving that software bad data. And there's no hope really to actually have the software do the correct job. It needs to identify the data type and adjust accordingly. So coming back to Capture One, it gets it right out of the box, right? And the reason for this is because Capture One identifies the type of file that it is. And specifically, we have Capture One for Fuji, which knows it's expecting X-Trans files to come in, and we get a great result because it's demosaicing as it should. So yes, indeed, it does get it right out of the box. But does that automatically make it the best? Well, the reason I make that statement is it's not that Lightroom is unable to demosaic X-Trans. It just doesn't do it automatically. It's an active step the photographer or whoever's doing the processing has to do to make sure that it is demosaicked and baked into pixels the correct way. Now, the deployment or the solution that Adobe provided for this was an option called Enhanced Details. Now, the way it's implemented is a bit deceptive. It feels like an additional filter that you apply to your image after the fact, but it's actually not. It is a way of interfacing with another way of demosaicing outside of the standard Bayer configuration that Lightroom is in. Now, in applications like raw therapy, you actually have these as a drop-down and you can choose. And there's like X-Trans and Bayer and all these different modes that you can choose on how you demosaic an image. And as you flip through them, you will see different levels of artifacting, and some are sharper, some are softer. It's basically how is it computing all the neighboring pixel values and how much do they influence, say, maybe the value of a specific pixel based on its neighbors. In the case of Lightroom, a modern approach these days is firstly that there is a known artifacting that happens when we debayer, or say basically demosaic an image. And we can use things like AI to look for scenarios in our pixel images, looking for those signals that, this might be prone to issues, and correct those adaptively. So throughout your image, you're adaptively correcting, and AI is an excellent tool to use for that. The problem with AI and running those processes, along with the more increased expense of X-Trans demosaicing, is this is now no longer a real-time process. So loading your image in and just expecting to be able to see a picture, remember, it's not a picture format, it has to render it. If that's something that doesn't happen in real time, it's probably better to render or process that into pixel values and then look at that result. And that's ultimately why it's a separate option completely from any setting of like when you're loading your images in as an X-Trans option there. Ultimately, Lightroom could implement that, but I feel like probably the way they've coded themselves into a corner, and it's very difficult for them to adaptively provide a switch. And probably in their eyes, they're seeing Enhanced Details as a superior demosaicing solution as opposed to a real-time one. So Enhanced Details is kind of clever in that it also does actually identify what the pattern is. It works on Bayer files as well. So any demosaicing artifacts can be helped by using this tool. The AI basically addresses those common demosaicing issues regardless of the pattern, and it is computationally expensive, so hence it becomes an offline process. Now, the real problem that this causes, and where I think it creates a divide in the community, is that it doesn't follow the conventional expectations of the user, in that you're expected to be able to open your raw file, see a preview of it, and that preview looks great. That it's converted that raw file into pixels as you'd expect, and you start working with it. So I think that can be a bit of a sticking point for many people. The other thing is that it is it can be quite expensive computationally. And the modern solution for processing lots of pixels within an image is using your GPU. Now, again, coming from a scenario that I have a desktop PC with a very powerful GPU, that's great. But if you're on a laptop, you may not have that. And the process of doing this conversion can probably, for a bunch of photos, run into the hours. On a modern desktop powerful computer, it's a few seconds per picture. It's not even really a big deal. But that's not to detract that this isn't for everyone. Okay. The other issue is that this baking of this value, not being on the fly in real time, is baking that into a file, a DNG file specifically, and that file needs to be stored, and that file is not small. It's not optimized. If it has to record R, G, and B for every pixel as a rendition, that is 3 times the amount of data right off the bat, then a raw file needs to store because it's only storing one value per pixel. So, if you're going to use this method, you better have a lot of storage and your disks better be fast if you want a smooth experience. So, not the end-all be-all to everything, okay? And we haven't even talked about it as final results, which we're going to do very shortly. As a summary, demosaicing can be very complex, okay? And it varies from application to application. Some present it as an open option, very transparently, like raw therapy, which is very transparent in all the operations that it applies to your images. Can be a little bit overwhelming technically, but you then have the ability to choose. You can choose exactly which method you use. And the advantage of that is, depending on that type of photography that you're doing, you actually get the option to use the right method for the job. For more information about that, check out this link, and they go into depth about their demosaicing options. Lightroom, on the other hand, presents this as a black box process, which doesn't even use the word demosaicing in it, and they present it in a way that is unintuitive for the user. Okay, it does not manage the expectations of how you correctly do this processing. My advice probably for Adobe would be, hey, when you import, maybe give us a checkbox that lets us process it there and just build the library out of enhanced details. I think the idea or the opted approach they took actually does make sense, and it works for me as well, in that I go through and use the low quality or the poor demosaicing to make decisions on which composition do I like best, which image does appear to be in focus or not. The level that we're working at, okay, or that we're talking about as far as demosaicing, doesn't stop you doing those things. So you can go ahead and make selects. And then only on your selects, you perform the next additional demosaicing step. Kind of interesting, kind of clever. But it's something that Capture One or Raw Therapy or other processes could very well come in and also provide. So, the race is on in that regard. Ultimately, each software, okay, that is the point of difference with software. They can use different methods or algorithms for demosaicing, which gives you a better starting point. But there is then also the element that we're not even going to discuss is like, okay, now we're going to do post-processing on it. We're going to sharpen, we're going to change color. The quality of those tools plays a huge part into the final result as well. And it is very much a case that then it may be like which ones you are more familiar with, that you work better with, and that you know how to basically manipulate the parameters to get the results that you need. Granted, I have not compared Capture One denoising to Lightroom denoising. They will have differences as well. Maybe you are, very acute to denoising methods, and you might go to a third-party option, say like Neat Image, which is probably superior than any real-time denoising that we see. Okay. And again, that's an example, where the real-time denoising versus offline denoising, generally the offline process is going to create a better result. And there is one other element that obviously there are all sorts of optimizations that the software manufacturer is going to force upon you. And these will come up in the test. But for example, if you load an image in, there's automatically going to be sharpening applied. There's automatically going to be probably some denoising and some saturation controls taking place. And it's important to remember that, because if we are genuinely just looking at the quality of your starting point, okay, and you apply the processing of your choice to get that image, we want to make sure we're aware of those. And that's really where we come to the point where we can take into consideration those things when we go ahead and look at our comparisons. So, post filters aside, how do the methods around demosaicing in those two softwares actually really compare? And this is where we come into apples to apples. A lot of the comparisons I've seen have not taken all these other things into account, and they make a big difference. So let's talk about some of the key things that we want to be looking at when we're comparing the results of transcoding our raw files into pixels. Firstly, imaging process can take place from the onset. When you actually take your raw files and you import them into your catalog, you may be already applying a first step of processing. Okay. These may be non-destructive, you may be able to turn those off, but be aware that they are there and that to disable them where possible. Color is an interesting one. Interpretation of color, okay, and that's something we hear differences between softwares as well, is somewhat subjective. There are different sciences that you can apply about how to take those raw values and interpolate basically a color target for them, a delivery, a color space per se. In the case of my tests, I have mapped both back to the Turner profile. Do I get a match? Nope. Is it close? Definitely. It's definitely close enough for us to compare, irrespective of worrying about which one is giving us the best color out of the gate. And it is a case that because we have those profiles, regardless of the quality of the profiles, the targets that we are sending those pixel values to can be pretty much almost matched. And I do matching in the test that is coming up next. Each app has manufacturer profiles applying corrections, and we want to disable those as we can. And this is a big one because when we talk about the process of demosaicing, and you have those pixel values made up of neighboring pixel values, that's what we know as a form of interpolation. And unfortunately, one of the things, and this is a Lightroom negative, is that it automatically applies manufacturer profiles. And it's something that you can't actually actively disable, but you can in Capture One. But then there's also the factor of order of operations. If I apply my corrections to where my samples for my pixels lie before I convert them to samples, I will get a better result than applying distortion correction after the fact. If we do it after, we get what we call in the VFX industry a filter kick. And it's the stacking of filter kicks that makes your image softer and softer and softer. And I feel like this is an area where Lightroom may need to improve. Again, it is a speculation of mine, but we'll see it in the comparisons as well. Now, when you're exporting your images, the images that we're comparing, those can, again, go through sharpening. If you don't pay attention, it may have a checkbox saying sharpen this image, and we need to make sure to disable that. We need to store the image as well in a format like TIFF 16-bit, which basically clamps down and leaves no interpretation of color or pixel values or anything like that. And for that, I chose 16-bit TIFF files, which are not floating point. The latitude or dynamic range is clipped in that file format, but the values are uncompressed and very true down to 16 bits for the value of color. And the other aspect is that it is processing that reveals the issue, right? So sometimes to evaluate the source, we need to look at the end result in an exaggerated form, and this is the art of tech checking that I talked before. We need to apply some processing to it to see or peer into that source to see if there are issues. And we want to do that exactly the same to each of our source images. So for that, I'm actually going to use Nuke, which is the compositing application we use in films to compile our images, as they have no bias and they're absolutely true 32-bit floating point processing, where I can actually pick up a network of corrections and apply it to any source image. And I can, if I make a change to one, it will translate that over onto the neighboring network. So very, very robust, fair, standardized processing applied to all our sources. So by that, I mean processing the test images must be identical. Okay. So without further ado, let's go ahead and look at the results. Okay, so here we are in Nuke, and we have a series of images loaded, and we can go ahead and make a comparison between the two. Now, I'll go ahead and quickly explain just what I have set up here, just so you can understand how I'm processing the image and how we're replicating that across our test images, and a couple of other things that I've just set up which might be interesting for you to know. So in this case, we started off with the default Lightroom demosaic, and I've got the image currently at 100%. If I just jump into 200%, I'm recording this on a 4K display, so this should appear equivalent to 100% for you. At times I may jump into 400%, which would then be equivalent to 200% for you watching the video. Now, between Lightroom and Capture One, there is a small pixel shift, something about basically can be the way the demosaicing works, but also lensing. So I have created a transform to correct for that, so those two images are pixel perfect on top of each other. Counterwise, the Capture One file has had a match grade process applied, which allows it to be a lot more similar to the Lightroom output with some subtle adjustments. The next thing we're doing is then applying a form of correction. We're creating a look for this image, which is based off some warming up of the image. We're also increasing saturation and contrast. And then ultimately, I'm doing this case just for some performance, especially under this match grade. Now, the other process that we generally do to our images is sharpening. And I've gone ahead here and done a sharpen system. Basically, normal sharpening, if we look at the settings here, I've got amount 0.5 and a size of 2. And if we even just apply that sharpening and you're looking closely, you start seeing those artifacts that we were talking about. Okay, if I boost the exposure here, you'll see those artifacts. We'll reset that. What I'm doing instead is I'm switching my color space, and basically I'm using the component color space mode, where I can just then operate on the red channel, which is just my luminance value, perform my sharpening, and then switch my color space back. So a good little trick that we sometimes do. And the difference is basically, if I just do a comparison here, that's before, that's after. So I'm getting exactly the same sharpening, but no edging or ringing effects. Okay, which is quite nice. And then we have that output. Now I have a little network down here, which we're going to get to. We're going to come back to that. That's basically evaluating the resolution of our color, basically the chroma component, not so much just the luminance. And it's going to come secondary because obviously we are most sensitive to luminance. That's basically just what the impression of detail is for us. So let's go ahead and load in Lightroom default, which we have here, and compare that to Capture One. And I'm going to set up a wipe here. So I'm going to put Capture One on this side and Lightroom on this side. So straight away, what we'll see is that the Lightroom result is noticeably softer than the output of Capture One. So the couple of things I want to point you to as far as when we talk about demosaicing, there's clearly some sort of like line skipping sort of issue here with the horizontals, which if we look in Capture One, seems to go away. So you'll see like a vertical line of pixels that kind of flip and they actually fill out the horizontal. So there's some sort of issue there. You will notice that the grain structure is a little bit more pronounced in the Capture One result, which ties in also with that high level of detail extraction. It's extracting those, even though it might be artifact or noise from the sensor, it is correctly actually extracting that detail out. So the pixels underneath or between that sensor noise is also obviously going to reflect in image quality. And you can see there is a lot more of that definition coming through. Another thing that's very kind of pronounced here actually is if you look at these two objects here, we have this 88 and some text. The text is at 400% here, or even at 200%, we come back, is not really that legible. Like if you look at this word here, I'm not really sure what that says. And if you look at the color, it looks like the color of the text is just bleeding out into the region. And we're going to have a look at the color resolution of this file very shortly. But if we wipe between to the Capture One, you'll see how much more clearly defined that is. And you can see now the text becomes legible. We can see it says unlawful. All right, so very clear indeed. To see more demosaicing artifacts, typically here in the verticals, we see more of that line skipping. When we wipe across, the verticals clear out. All of these fine details here in the building, which feel very painterly, okay, all resolve much cleaner. And you can even see here in these windows where we have a lot of vertical and horizontal structures, they seem to almost oscillate in these different patterns, but if we wipe across, we can actually see like all of these verticals here that we're seeing through here. And I'm at, even if I come back, say, to 200%, they look vertical here, we wipe across, they're actually horizontal. So definitely some issues there. Making our way, one area where we are seeing some interesting quality differences is that Lightroom, even with its poor demosaicing, is getting a pretty decent result compared to Capture One in this logo. And the last thing I want to touch upon here is just the grain structure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to gamma down and expose up. And you'll see here that the grain structure is definitely finer, more pronounced with higher contrast. And the Lightroom one, you can almost see the swirling pattern, okay? Which is basically, there you go, there is our worms. And you can see how Lightroom is not achieving that, or sorry, not actually suffering from that, because it just breaks up its noise structure, its grain structure to be much, much finer, which certainly helps with the swirling pattern. Okay, let's reset. And this time, let's do a comparison now. I'm going to flip this image out for enhanced details. So I'll flip it out here. And you'll see here, even if I just go ahead and just flip for a second, the original Lightroom and enhanced details. Okay, and you can see all that extra detail pop back in. And what I'll actually do just for a moment is just compare Lightroom's options. And you'll see here straight away, these demosaicing artifacts, okay, they resolve themselves, and we get, we still have some issues. I think, you know, it's not perfect. And as we wipe across here, what we can see, and I think this is the most impressive thing about enhanced detail, is not just the luma detail, but the color detail. If you look at all that color detail that comes out, especially around this what might be a life ring here, the blues and the reds through here, okay? And if we look at the lettering here, super clean, and the text super, super crisp as well, okay? So any really small details of color, like these lines and these nicks here, okay, which didn't have any color before, really pop out. Okay, let's flip over to Capture One. So on this side here is Capture One. And you'll see here that, again, even if we look in here at the 88s, if we do a wipe between those two, look how much cleaner the enhanced detail structure is in this particular image. Okay, let me come back to 400, so 200% for you. As we wipe across, overall the noise structure just seems a whole lot less, and we're still seeing further resolving or like a sharpness come through in the image. Okay, you'll note that the verticals, all of those are also addressed. The building windows here, even better again, they've switched back to a vertical, so there was some demosaicing artifacts actually from Capture One that was tripping us up. And if we go look at the H&M, okay, we see here, wow, okay, it's like resolving twice the resolution there, easy. This one is even at 1:1 for you. Oops. Let me just spin that around again. At 1:1 for you, it's clearly handling that much better. And let's touch back to the grain structure here, because that was a big talking point for us. You'll see here that there is still sort of the Capture One file definitely has still a little bit more of this graininess, and we've identified that Lightroom here is a bit softer, but it has these finer details now. And if I show you the difference just between Lightroom default, you can see, I'm going to push this even further, you can see really the issue is that it's that high frequency detail. Without that high frequency detail, there's nothing to break up that wormy structure, and that's where our worms come from, okay? Now, that's not to say that there is no wormy structure in here, or if you perform denoising and sharpening as part of your post-processing workflows, that you couldn't reproduce this issue. And that might be where some people are seeing worms within their workflow, even though they're using enhanced details. All right, now, as I promised, I have a network down here that, that does a simple little trick. And let me explain it here. I'm going to take the output of this image, and let's go ahead, and that's what we're looking at right now. I'll just turn off the wipe for a second. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to desaturate the image. And the desaturation method I'm using is the luminance of an average. So we're taking the average luminance of the color. So this would equate that if we didn't have a Bayer filter on there, and that the perceived luminance of red, green, and blue didn't vary, which they do for our eye, that it just basically, you know, even keel on energy. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the original color image once more, and I'm breaking it out to the side here, take the saturation, and I'm going to divide it. And what that basically does is it removes values. So you can see down here that we have sort of a bluish black value here. And if I take the desaturated value and look at the difference between those two, or divide this value by itself, all that's going to remain is the color. All right, so I've extracted now out the color, and we can just look at how much color definition we are getting in our image, irrespective of luminance. Now, we know this should be a low quality image because we are interpolating basically as part of the sensor pattern and the photo site layout on the sensor that we shouldn't be getting the same. Now, it's a little hard to see, and this is just the presentation of the data in its raw form. I go here, and I'm just going to chuck a grade on here with some offset and gamma. It just brings it down into a way where we can inspect it. And this is the result of Lightroom. And what you'll see is just how poorly actually the color of the text is actually smearing and actually polluting other areas of the pixel. It's the region here why things like the small color variations through here didn't even have a chance to exist in the way that we're smearing and populating out. You'll see some low frequency patterning noise. That's just low frequency detail or color noise, but basically the resolution of this image as we perceive it is fairly low. And if I was just to take the same setup and apply it to Capture One, okay, you can see all the color resolution tighten up significantly. Now, we still get a lot of variance. Generally, these larger forms of noise are actually very easy to smooth out in our processing, which would make this a smoother image. But I think the key thing here is where we have changes of color value. Okay, you can see how much definition we're losing. There is some sharpness. The algorithm is bringing some sort of detail through, but as far as having precise pinpoint unique color, Capture One superior. You're getting all that color in there, all the variation, which is really important, especially when we're talking about things like the color of these window frames, which in this case, even here at 1:1 for you guys, they appear white. Here they appear pink. Interestingly enough, let's take a look at enhanced details. And sure enough, you'll see another whole layer of color resolution pop in. So it's getting far more refined. I would say, again, it's improved twice-fold again. And that's kind of the evidence that we saw down here, where if we're comparing this color of this bin to the enhanced details, why we're getting so much richer and better color through there based off the subject matter. So to say, Capture One is so much better for color, maybe in the hues that you're getting, but as far as the definition of highly detailed and lots of color variance, I would agree to disagree. Okay, let's keep it at that. Now, in this observation, this was a clear win for enhanced details. Okay, we were getting a lot more color definition. The sharpness was definitely coming through very strongly. If I just switch back here, I mean, even through here, you'll see a lot less noise in the source, and we're pulling in more detail. But that's not the end of it. I have another image here, okay, and let's have a look at the image as a whole. It is kind of an awful image. Well, it's actually, by being awful, it's actually excellent test for what we're looking at. We have a lot of bright light sources. We have lots of underexposure, overexposure, and we even have Cookie Monster. Never noticed that. And the results here are kind of interesting. So we look at a processed version, and what I've gone ahead and done is I've lifted up the blacks a little bit, added some contrast and some sharpening as well. There's not much really for us to look directly in the center of the image, but if we jump down into here, we can see some details and we see some aberration and stuff. Actually, let me try this stuff here. We'll see if we can see what we need to see. And let's go ahead and wipe that between Capture One. All right, so let me go find my tool. Okay, so Lightroom B versus Capture One B. And you'll see here straight away that Capture One is once again resolving much sharper. Now, you'll note there was a transformation here, and I definitely tried correcting for this, but it didn't really work. And the reason being was that this image was shot on a different lens to that last example. And what is happening is Lightroom does not allow me to disable that correction profile from the manufacturer. Where in Capture One, I was able to do it, but I had to intentionally actually turn it back on as part of the lensing. Now, the thing is, I feel like, firstly, the distortions don't perfectly match, and I feel like Lightroom may be performing that lens operation. I may be wrong here, but they're performing after the demosaic. And what this causes is that filter kick, or filter hit, where we basically are subjecting our pixel values to a transformation that creates a filter hit. To just really clearly explain what I mean by that, when you transform something of anything less than a pixel, like if I try and move this, say, 0.5 of a pixel, okay, and we compare those two results, okay, what we ultimately end up doing to our images, hang on, let me try that again, say 1.75, okay, come on, behave, let me turn this wipe off. You'll see here we have a lot of sharp detail, you see the noise. As soon as we transform it, it gets softer. Only a little bit, but do this enough times and we'll have a problem. And I think distortion correction is going to cause that as well. So let's go ahead and we'll look down here somewhere at some of the subject matter and we'll look at the final result. So this is Lightroom out, Capture One out. Let's do a wipe. And sure enough, we're getting a crisper grain pattern. But the other thing that we notice here is, Lightroom, is how much softer Lightroom is again. Okay. Now, we'd expect based off our previous results that Lightroom Enhanced Details should come out fairly strong here. But if I flip over to it, Enhanced Details, let me load it in, Enhanced Details B, okay, it's still softer. So in this case, Capture One is still producing a sharper image. And I think the reason for this is because the Enhanced Details is working again post-distortion. We are processing, running the Enhanced Details, not directly from the raw, but the image that has already been de-lensed by the manufacturer. Otherwise, it's fairly comparable. I mean, there is that softness. I actually feel like the Enhanced Detail has even less artifacts than our Capture One result. Like if you look at the little nick here, okay, you can see that there is some artifacting taking place there. And this artifacting varies as we go around the image. In some areas, one is performing better, and others it's the other way around. So for example, if we make our way over here, okay, where was it? We're definitely, this textural detail, we're getting a lot more out of Capture One, okay? You'll see the color seems to be a little bit more natural, okay? You can see this artifacting in the color of the screen while Enhanced Details is handling that a lot better. But then there's other areas where, let me see if I can find it, up here in the orange, okay, you can see that Capture One is doing a beautiful, clean, smooth result of that, while here Enhanced Details having more trouble. Like I say, this image is notorious for being difficult as far as what's in it. You'll see that sometimes the color is better in one and the other, and so on. As far as grain structure, this is a much higher ISO image. The first one was shot at 160, I think, and this one is up at 1600. So the noise structures kind of reflect a little bit what we saw in our analysis of the grain, where here it's much finer. Here we have a much larger detail. If we were to switch back to the Lightroom default, you'll see that there is just the high frequency detail is lost. Overall, I think there is more separation in the blacks than in Capture One. Okay, as far as like where that black point sits, which might be just part of the strategy of just letting some of those details fall away in the case of reducing the contrast in the noise structure. It might be Capture One's strategy there, but also color profiles at this end are very, very sensitive, and it's probably just the difference in color signs as they were approached. So that for me is a win for Capture One. So that got me thinking. It's like, well, okay, what's the situation here? Is it that Lightroom is better tailored to low ISO images, and that's where we're getting that improvement? Or is it to do with that lensing result? I've talked a lot about the lensing because that's the conclusion I came to. And to do a test, I've loaded a third image here. Again, this image here now is actually shot back at ISO 160, so it's a low ISO image, but it was shot with the same lens we saw in the previous photo, and it's doing lots of lens correction. The first photo was shot with the 14mm, and it seems there is no distortion profile mapped for it. So it wasn't doing any of those corrections. And let's jump in and look at the final result for Lightroom. And this is one, I think it's a classic again, just like trees and landscape. At 1:1, already here in the greens of the leaves, you can see like the swirly pattern. Again, the compression in this video, you might struggle. If I just move this around just to get a real fine read, you may see that there. But if we compare that to Capture One, so I'm going to go Lightroom C, wipe against Capture One C. Sure enough, you can see there is a distortion difference there again, but you also see a whole lot of extra detail come out. Okay, and pretty much that's kind of the takeaway here. That, sorry for the redraws. Yeah, as we come through here, it is probably out-resolving those trees there, even at 1:1 here, just for the sake of the internet video, and where we see these really swirly patterns. You can see how much greatly that's improved. But we do have that lens distortion shift. So let's go ahead now, and I'm going to go ahead and load in enhanced details instead. And you can see, okay, we still have that shift. But as far as the details concerned, there is a bit of extra sharpness that's just coming through from Capture One. And this got me thinking. It's got me thinking that, okay, so when people are testing this, depending on the lens and the distortion profile that they have applied, and when in the order of operations that profile has been applied, people might actually be just genuinely in their tests seeing these sharper results. But that's not to say Lightroom is out of the picture at this point. Other software considerations aside, I do want to showcase once again the resolving power for color in Lightroom. Okay, so if we compare the original, okay, so this is basically, let me just turn off my wipe. Okay, this is the image that I get when we look at default Lightroom. And as far as resolution, you can see sort of the embossed frequency level here. It's not great. You can almost see this is about as detailed as we're getting. In the trees, it's not so great either. Let me just bring the exposure down a bit, just so we're in gamut. And you can see, like, there's no color variation in those leaves at all. There's a little bit of reds poking through, but it's very piecemeal, and it only seems to be happening on diagonals. Probably something that the demosaicing artifact is kind of actually bringing in. This could very well even be false color. If we flip over to Capture One, greatly improved. You can see now the branches, or the timber here, the branches, which would have their own color separate from the leaves, won't actually just be green like they appear to be here. Now, if we compare that result, I'm just going to actually copy this whole network and paste it over here to Lightroom's. Okay, then let's say grade 2 and grade 3. Okay, you can see that once again, as far as color definition, okay, we're getting a heck of a lot more out of Lightroom. So I think what's happening is we're seeing basically a bit more of a softer approach with Capture One, while Enhanced Details is running tighter color, but unfortunately some issues around luminance as far as what I deem to be probably distortion related is affecting it. Because if you are on a lens which does not have a profile or a correction, Enhanced Details seem to win. High ISO, but again, it was hard to differentiate whether it was the ISO that was the issue, albeit we do see variable performance within high ISO images, so it could go either way, but the distortion I think may be a problem. And we confirmed it with the third image here, where it is a low ISO image, pretty much the same sort of style as the first image, but Capture One is outperforming a little bit in the Luma, while Lightroom is providing more color detail. Okay, so as a comparison conclusion, based off our images, we do see that default Lightroom demosaicing is bad news. And for all the softness that we see in luminance, okay, ultimately it's even worse for color, okay. For the halving of the resolution, I feel that we're probably getting with Bayer demosaicing on X-Trans, we're probably losing that again in color. So it almost defeats the point of owning an X-Trans sensor. And the images I see are much more akin to the warbling or the marbling that I expect from my phone camera. C1 is indeed better than above, and that's a lot of the comparisons we see between the applications. That's where they're based. They look at Lightroom demosaicing by default and C1 and see a huge difference. Almost, yeah, it is. At 1:1, you even notice it, and you're only at the start of, you're only at the start line. So definitely agree that C1 performs very well compared to Lightroom default. Lens profiles come into play. Okay, so as I mentioned before we started the comparison, that things like where you perform your delensing or distortion corrections and whether you can turn those even off may affect image quality quite drastically. And it comes back to then that if you are looking to photograph the highest quality, you might want a system where you can either disable or that the delensing actually happens at the correct stage in the process. Okay, and given the fact that enhanced detail is probably baking that stuff down and then we're correcting, if you want to correct after that, that's not the right place to do it. You need to do that beforehand, and that's probably something that Capture One can provide. Granted, your choice of lens, whether it has a profile or not, comes into it, and that was in the case of my test examples, as was shown. C1 demosaicing, ultimately, I think as an algorithm, the observation I made is that it has a softer quality. It takes into account more of the neighboring pixels and influences a specific pixel value with more information around it. What we lose is probably a little bit of luma definition, that perception of sharpness, but what we gain probably is a more accurate color. It can also actually introduce another form of artifacting, okay? And I think it's that they do a mix or a blend to then also try and retain that high frequency luma detail. So we get this very fine detail structure sitting on top of a softer demosaicked image. In terms, both at this point are great in image quality, correct imaging workflow applied, that is. But then it does come into other factors like application features. Ultimately, it comes down to using what works best for you. There are benefits to both